Can the Middle East find a peaceful path? David Newman, a specialist in geopolitics at Ben-Gurion University in Israel, is optimistic. He'll explain why next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Building bridges between Israelis and Palestinians requires the help of scholars, journalists, and political activists, among others. David Newman of Israel's Ben-Gurion University is all three. Welcome to the show, Dr. Newman.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
Tell us about the key part of your work. What do you do on a daily basis when you get up in the morning?
Well, actually, at the present, I'm dean of a very large faculty of humanities and social sciences, but I assume you're referring to my professional work. And I work in the field of geopolitics, and within the field of geopolitics, I particularly work in looking at the area of border studies and how significant borders are in the world today, how we draw them, how we demarcate them, how we manage them, and how we control them. And because of all of the events of the past 10 years, it's become increasingly important again in the world.
Talk to us about borders specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian context.
Well, it's interesting that Israel has potentially 5 borders, but only 2 of them are recognized internationally. The border between Israel and Egypt and the border between Israel and Jordan, because we had peace treaties with them in the late 80s and the 90s. But Israel still has 3 borders with Lebanon, with Syria, and of course, if it's ever to happen with a future Palestinian state, which still have to be determined and agreed and ratified.
So how do you deal with the complexities of all of those border questions?
Well, each one is a very different story. I think we all know exactly where the border between Israel and Lebanon is. We went back to there when Israel withdrew from Lebanon 15 years ago, and that remains, of course, if ever one day there was to be an agreement between the 2 countries, I don't think there would be much discussion over where the border needs to be. In the case of Syria, what's left of Syria today, if there was ever to be a stable regime in Syria again, and there was to be a return to discussions, then the border is very much related to the question of who retains control over the Golan Heights. Is the border going to mean that the Golan Heights is in Syria, or does it remain with Israel? And for Israel, that's a very big security question.
Let's go back to the Declaration of Principles back in the early 1990s. Where were you when this was established in terms of peace between Israel and the Palestinians and the prospect of a Palestinian state? Well,
I was already in Israel, and of course, what emerged out of the Declaration of Principles, what we call the Oslo Accords, the 2 Oslo Accords, was a temporary map of the West Bank, divided into many different types of areas, Palestinian autonomy areas, with the idea that you would take a 5-year period to discuss many of the issues, refugees, Jerusalem, water, and borders, and after 5 years you would reach some final resolution of all of these issues, and as we know, that never happened. It fell through for all sorts of reasons. But what emerged out of that was there was a great deal of what we call Track 2 discussions, Track 2 negotiations, in which diplomats and politicians and academics all became involved. And I was involved in a number of groups that looked at territory and at borders. And we tried to think, how can you best draw a border which would satisfy the needs of both sides, or to put it better, in which each side would come out equally dissatisfied. That would be the ideal outcome, because there is no clean, simple border. If there had been one, it would have been drawn long ago.
What was your opinion of the problems that developed, as you said, that led to the Declaration's goals not being accomplished?
Well, I think, you look at attempts to resolve conflicts all around the world. We often compare it, say, to Ireland or to other conflicts. And there are always on both sides groups who are peace spoilers. People who, for whatever ideological or political reasons, don't want peace to happen. They don't want stability to happen.
Where are we now in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian difference?
I think that unfortunately we're further away. I think there was a very short period of euphoria after the Oslo Accords. And I think there was a period of belief after the evacuation or the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza 10 years ago, when, of course, a very right-wing Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, led the way, and even intimated that he was going to do similar things in the West Bank, there was a certain belief that said, well, let's wait and see what happens. Maybe we're moving towards two states finally. But of course, everything that's happened since then, rockets coming over from Gaza, 2 wars involving Gaza and Israel, has meant that public opinion has changed. And the left has moved to the center and the center has moved to the right. People are much less prepared to make those concessions they were prepared to make 10 years ago. And that's reflected, of course, in the election results as well, in which Netanyahu was re-elected for a 4th time as Prime Minister of Israel.
Talk to us about your different roles. We have a sense of what you do academically, but you're also prominent as a journalist and prominent as a political activist. How do you juggle those three?
Well, first of all, I'm not a journalist. I write an op-ed column,
commentator.
But coming from, my professional or academic perspective, not every column I write obviously is about politics or about Israel-Palestine, but at least 50% are. And I try always to bring what I do professionally to bear on the public discourse. There may have been a conference at the university this week dealing with Israeli social or political issues. There may have been a major negotiation taking place on borders, and I can draw that out and give some wider context, but also to make an opinion. When it comes to writing the op-ed column, I'm opinionated, which of course I'm not in the classroom or in my research. So it allows me to reach a different audience, a much larger audience, and I think it's very important for academics and scientists to be part of the public discourse. I think part of the criticism that sometimes we sit in ivory towers and don't think of what's going on outside our gated communities, I think part of that criticism is correct. And although we shouldn't sacrifice the quality of our research, we do need to bring the topics to the wider public discourse and be part of the discourse which is going on.
What happens in response? Do you get lots of hate mail or hate email?
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, I'm on the left of centre in Israeli politics. I don't think on the radical left, but certainly on the left. I'm critical of the occupation. I'm very supportive of and believe in the legitimacy and the existence of the State of Israel. I define myself very much as a Zionist who very proudly went to live in Israel from England, not because of anti-Semitism, because I believe that's where I as a Jew can fulfill myself. And yet at the same time, I'm critical of certain policies of a government. And because I, like you in America, live in a democracy where everybody can make their own opinion and write what they have to say, whether they be Jewish or Arab, I use that to the fullest to try and influence the public discourse. But unfortunately, the discourse both within Israel and between Israel and the wider Jewish diaspora has become very radicalized in the last 10 or 15 years, the right wing and the left wing. And some of the hate mail I get in the box on a Tuesday morning, actually the first mail comes from North America because they read the column 6 hours prior to getting up in Israel. Some of it can be very nasty indeed. And I've learned how to deal with that. I've learned to have thick skin. I've learned not to read too much of the responses. And also my editor of the Jerusalem Post once told me, he says, don't worry. He says, it doesn't matter what you write. 80% of the feedback will always be people who disagree with what you write. On the whole, most people who agree with what you write won't necessarily write to tell you that. So after 10 years of writing these columns, I've come to terms with it.
Tell us about an issue that seems to particularly be irritating to some readers.
Well, I think the whole issue of whether Israel should withdraw from the territories, and again, the term you use, whether you use the term territories or occupied territories or administered territories, already is a political statement. I try and use neutral terms to the extent I can, but I think that whole issue is very, very contentious. Because for Israelis on both sides of the political spectrum, the question of occupying or withdrawing from the West Bank or Judea and Samaria is for them an existential issue. There are Israelis who believe that if you withdraw, you are therefore committing security suicide for Israel, and therefore you are weakening Israel's security posture. There are many Israelis who believe that if you don't withdraw, you are equally committing demographic suicide, because you continue to control a population who in 10, 20 or 25 years will be equal to the Jewish population, and then you've lost the Jewish majority of the state, the whole raison d'etre of what the state is all about. So in other words, both political positions, they're not just simple politics about another 2% in taxation. Both sides see this as the future existence of the state of Israel, and therefore attitudes and tend to get very, very hot in this political debate.
And I would imagine they're hottest surrounding the issue of Jerusalem itself.
Yes, they are, but I think most Israelis believe, if we can't resolve the other issues first, there's no point in talking about Jerusalem yet, because however difficult everything else is, Jerusalem is even more difficult. And we're so far away from resolving the other issues yet, Jerusalem hasn't really figured prominently on the debating table. There are people who raise it. The whole issue of building a wall down the middle of Jerusalem is very problematic. The whole issue of if in the future there will one day be two states, will Jerusalem be a capital for both states or only for the Israeli state? There are big issues out there. The real contentious issue about Jerusalem is much less the Jewish and the Palestinian, the Israeli and the Palestinian neighborhoods. The real crux of the matter there is who controls the old city and the holy sites.
Is this something you wish had been addressed and corrected before the establishment of the State of Israel?
I think that's, I think when you look at any conflict, that's very difficult to say. You often feel that Israel is the stronger partner in this conflict. You sometimes feel, from my position, that had we offered the things we're offering today, but had we done them always 10 years ago, then maybe there would have been a greater chance of them being accepted, and maybe sometimes we left the offers too late. We responded to events rather than took events as leaders. And I think there are a number of points in the last 50, 60 years when you feel that maybe that could have been the case. But it's a bit too easy in these conflicts to say the if of history. History has its realities, and those realities change over time. And whenever you do get back to the negotiation table, you have to deal with the realities of today, not with the realities of yesterday.
Let's assume, for sake of discussion, that you're prime minister. What would be your starting point in terms of the border issue?
Look, there are a number of issues out there. Borders are one of them. I work with borders, so I see it as the most important. But of course, that's not the only issue. There are issues of Jerusalem, of refugees, of water, of legitimacy, of mutual recognition, which you may say, well, isn't really a tangible thing. But for Israel, it's a very symbolic thing that the world, the Arab world should come and say that as a result of a peace agreement, we recognize the existence. That may only be a sentence, but that says a great deal for the average Israeli. And I think both Israelis and Palestinians are very good at not understanding sometimes what is important symbolically to the other side, and not being prepared to make that extra gesture, that extra confidence-building measure, which could build 0 trust to 3% trust. But I think the first thing that any Israeli prime minister and any Palestinian leader has to do, have to somehow be prepared, despite the huge differences that they have today, to simply sit around this table like we're sitting here and begin to talk to each other. It's all very easy to say we don't have partners. As long as we say we don't have partners, we will not talk about anything. So the first thing that I think I, as an Israeli prime minister, which I'm never going to be, would do is to say, I'm prepared to talk to someone as a partner, even if I don't agree with their positions. But first of all, I have to sit down and talk with him.
And then after you sit down and begin to talk, what should be the first item of business?
That's a very hard one to say, because there are so many items out there. I think what concerns both sides more than anything else is the issue of security and safety. I think Israel wants to be absolutely and totally sure that it's not going to have bombs blowing up on buses and bombs blowing up in shopping malls. And the Palestinians want to be absolutely sure that they don't see Israeli soldiers and tanks in their backyards for whatever reasons that may be. I think you have to see an end to the signs, the symbols of what the other side represents to them.
There are some Israelis and many people in other countries who don't believe there should be a Palestinian state. What is the best rationale in your mind for one?
The rationale in my mind is that it's the worst of all it's the best of all the bad possible solutions to the conflict. There are people both on the right and on the left of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict who don't believe in two states. On the right, you have, let's say, the pro-settler movements, the religious Zionists, who believe that all of the land should remain under Jewish control because historically and even religiously, they don't use the term conquered. They say it's returned, it's been liberated by the Jewish people. Therefore, they oppose the notion of any other form of state entity within that territory. But you also have on the far left, and also amongst the Palestinians, people who don't believe in two states, who believe that there's no place in the world today for religious or nation states, and that this should be a single, democratic, binational, secular democracy in one territory, and everyone should be equal. Now, there are two ideological positions. They come from completely opposite positions, but they are common in one fact: they see the territory as a single unit without a border running down the middle. I think most Israelis, and I think like many Palestinians, believe that neither of those are in any way possible today, and that given the animosity and the violence and the history of conflict between the two peoples, you can only move forward by the first stages, and let's call it at this stage conflict resolution, not a peace agreement, but the first stages of conflict resolution. You need to separate. You need to allow both peoples their own space, their own autonomy, and to allow them the space of time to be ensured that the other side no longer represents a threat.
You've had the experience of living in two democracies, and even though they're under the same umbrella, they're very, very different systems. Are there certain things that democracies can learn from each other in terms of running for office and other aspects of governing?
Well, Israel, of course, has just gone through an election. We have too many elections in too short a period of time, every 2 or 3 years. And that's partly because of the system that we use, which is proportional representation, which is actually extremely democratic. But we only have a single national constituency, and we have national lists. And therefore, we don't have any sort of division of power into 2 or 3 larger parties, which allows stability and allows a government to manage the country for at least 4 to 5 years. The other country I know well, Britain, of course, is also a democracy, but has a completely opposite system, one which is quite similar to the United States system in many respects, and which actually allows for greater stability because it limits the ability of only 2 or 3 parties to actually be elected, which means it's not very proportional. But, and it sacrifices proportionality for the sake of stability. Whereas in Israel, we sacrifice stability for the sake of proportionality. These are the two extremes of the electoral systems in the world. And most countries, if you look throughout Western Europe, have a mixture of the two. They have what are mixed systems so that they can find a better balance between the two.
In terms of external relations, again, with you as Prime Minister, what would be your priorities, relations with the United States and other key countries with which Israel works?
Well, I have to admit to a secret, and I'm one of Israel's great pro-Europeanists. But that doesn't mean I don't understand that the single greatest ally for the state of Israel is the United States of America. And I think many Israelis are very worried about the tensions which have emerged recently between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. There are some who see it simply as a ploy by Netanyahu to bolster his security image in the lead up to the elections so that more people would vote for him, Mr. Security, as they did at the last moment. There are others who see this as a much more structural issue, and they're worried about the future of the relations between Israel and the United States. If sort of Netanyahu is there for another few years, Obama, maybe Hillary or someone on the Democratic side, and they see this as a problem because they all understand that however much the EU is an important player and has a lot to offer, it is never going to take the place of the United States as the #1 third party in this conflict.
And I would imagine the United States sees things in a similar way because in all parts of the world it typically has one country that is the linchpin of its policy. In the Middle East, that's very much Israel.
Yes, but I think it's fair to say that the Palestinians too understand that if the United States played a major role as a third-party facilitator, then they could also rely on them to a certain extent. I think the Palestinians would be less worried about the Europeans being the #1 partner. Israel would only ever allow the Europeans to be the #2 or the #3 on the list. But I think both sides understand that a peace agreement would need somebody to deliver things from the outside as well, which could be financed, by the way. It could be peacekeeping troops. And remember that the big peacekeeping troop in Sinai is not a United Nations troop. It's a multinational army headed by the United States of America. And that's always been Israel's preferred position.
Is the prospect of peace with Lebanon on the horizon? And given Syria's chaos, is Syria just going to be a permanent problem for the entire region?
Well, we have, of course, formal peace agreements with both Egypt and Jordan. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't delude ourselves that that came out of a love of each country for the other. It came out of a very real political perspective, the best interests of every country in its own time, and actually the United States' financial support of Egypt over a period of 30 years. People often forget that Egypt is the second largest supported country after Israel of the United States. I think I saw the figure that something like 60 to 70% of American foreign aid goes to two countries, to Israel and Egypt. I think we were much closer to having something with Lebanon until 20 years ago. Today, given the Hezbollah and the radicalization of Islamic politics, that's not on the cards at the moment. Syria, of course, is not on the cards. We don't even know who really controls or manages Syria today and what Syria is going to look like 2 or 3 or 5 years down the road from now. So I don't see any real movement. There are various informal economic relations with other countries in the Gulf states which are not formal. They don't have any peace agreements as such. But there are, I would say, informal relations to do with economics and to do with other issues of mutual concern, which is what geopolitics is all about, where countries have mutual interests to both sides.
Talk to us about the Syria challenge long term. Most people didn't think it would last this long, and it doesn't seem to have any signs of ending. To the extent that this continues, what sorts of challenges does that pose for the region?
Well, I think it's very interesting. Of course, Israel has been very silent about issues relating to Egypt and to Syria over the last few years, because on the one hand, Israel believes in democracy. So in principle, it believes in the concept of the Arab Spring. But of course, Israel has enjoyed stability in the region by having Assad and Mubarak, until he was deposed, in very dictatorial fashion, controlling their states. So that served Israel's long-term strategic interests much better. But of course, the so-called Arab Spring has become the Arab Winter. And what democracy has thrown up has been the Islamic State and much greater threats than anybody else or any other group presents to Israel. So I'm sure Israeli intelligence are following things very closely, but on the whole, they're standing back, and I think they themselves are waiting to see how things turn out over the next year, 2 or 3 years, before it makes any major policy decision concerning its relationships with Syria.
You were talking about changing roles in global affairs. If you're standing in Israel looking out at the world and you see new centers of influence, rising powers and such, is it in Israel's best interest to move in those directions, at least to some extent, while keeping the relationship with the United States to avail itself of opportunities there? It's
in its best interest, and it's doing that. Israel has very good relations with India. Israel has interesting relationships with Russia. I would say, but it's a positive relationship. Yes, there are many things they disagree strongly with Russia with, particularly Russia's position on Syria. But on the whole, there's a fairly good relationship, not least because of the 1 million Russians that came to live in Israel in the 1990s. Many of them have trading links and business links. And don't forget that the current foreign minister of Israel, Avigdor Lieberman, the current chair of the Knesset, of the parliament, they're both former Russian refuseniks. So there are strong links. And Israel has good, reasonable relations with China, with Korea, academically, scientifically, economically. So Israel is looking, and I think has been promoting, wider international cooperation in the past few years.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Newman.
Thank you.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.